There is a place in the heart of the Cormanthor forest where the trees grow taller than they should, where the seasons have always been gentler than the latitude allows, where the air still carries something the elves once called the song. Travelers who pass through the eastern edges of the Dale lands speak of it without meaning to. They feel it before they see it. The forest hushes, the light changes. Birds that should be present are not, and birds that should not be present sing softly in branches that do not belong to any tree the woodsman would name. Then the ground begins to lift and the broken stones come into view, and a road that was once paved in white marble runs for a few paces under the leaves before vanishing again into root and moss. This is what is left of the greatest city the elves of Faerun ever built. The city of song, the city of love, the city of crowns and spells and bards. Drannor, capital of Cormanthor, and for a brief and brilliant span of 400 years, the closest thing the surface world ever came to a true and lasting peace between the races. I have read every account of this place that I could find, and I will tell you now that almost all of them get the same thing wrong. They treat Drannor as a tragedy of arrogance, as if the elves built too high and were struck down for it. My reading of this is different. The fall of Drannor is not a story about hubris. It is a story about how fragile any good thing is, and how the death of even one wise ruler can be enough to unmake 1,000 years of work, and how the worst enemies of a peaceful kingdom are almost never the monsters at the gate. They are the noble houses inside the walls, the slow rot of council politics, the quiet erosion of the dream after the dreamer dies. And so, when I think about the broken towers and the strangled roads and the things that still hunt in the ruins, I do not think first of the demons that came at the end. I think of the long, gentle, beautiful afternoon that came before and how easy it was to lose. This is the story of Drannor, the city of song, from its founding in the wild forests of ancient Arkorar nearly 4,000 years before the Dale Reckoning began, through its golden age under coronal Eltargrim to the weeping war that ended it, and the brief renaissance that came centuries later, only to be crushed again under the falling weight of a dying empire. It is one of the longest and most painful stories in all of Faerunean lore, and we are going to walk it together from the first stone to the last. To understand Drannor, you have to understand what came before it, and what came before it was Arkorar. Long before the city existed, long before the kingdom of Cormanthor was named, the great eastern forest that we now call Cormanthor was simply Arkorar, the Wormwood, a vast sea of elven trees stretching from the Moon Sea south almost to the Sea of Fallen Stars. Scattered through it were the small elven realms that had survived the Crown Wars, those terrible internecine conflicts among the Telquasir that had broken the elven world long ages before. By the time we are speaking of, there were 4 such realms living quietly in Arkorar. Semberholm in the south around its great lake, Jyrenstar to the east, the tangled trees, and at the spiritual center of them all, the Elven Court, a holy meeting place rather than a city, where the elves of the great forest gathered to deliberate, to worship, and to remember. In the year minus 3,983 by the Dale Reckoning, the coronal Kavoerm Irithel gathered the 4 realms together and bound them into one kingdom. He called the kingdom Cormanthor. He raised a new city in its center and called the city Cormanthor, after the forest. He summoned the rule tower from elven high magic to be the seat of his throne, and the elf blade Arkor Kerim to be the test of any who would succeed him. From that moment until the very end, only one who could draw that blade from its place in the rule tower could rule as coronal of Cormanthor. Any pretender who tried, the histories say, found instant death. My interpretation of this is that the elves built their succession on something deliberately brutal because they did not trust ambition. The blade was not a sword. The blade was a test and a refusal and a warning. For 4,000 years after its founding, Cormanthor flourished without serious incident. Think about that for a moment. 4,000 years. Empires of men have risen and fallen many times in that span. The histories of the human kingdoms of Faerun barely stretch that long. But the elves of Cormanthor, in their long forest with their long lives, simply went on. The coronals came and went. The houses planted their Kira gems, those crystal heirlooms that contain the memory of a noble line, and the Kira passed from parent to child and on again. Each Kira was a thing of immense value, prized less for its material worth than for the ancestral memory it carried. To don the gem of a great house was to wear the accumulated wisdom of every elder who had borne it before, and to lose a Kira was to lose a fragment of a family's soul. The Akfair, the Spellmagers Guild of War Wizards, refined its craft across the centuries, developing battle magics that no other people in the realms could match. The Akvilar, the standing army, drilled in the green clearings, perfecting the use of the longbow and the curved elven blade. Beneath them in the shadows worked the Envalar, the silent guard, the spies and assassins of the realm who answered only to the coronal. The smith Demron forged the first of the Baneblades in 358 DR, swords specifically wrought to slay the lower planar fiends the elves had long sworn to oppose, and these weapons would in time become some of the most storied artifacts in Elven history. Generation after generation of elves grew up under those eternal trees and never once questioned that their world would always be as it was. This is, I think, the most important thing to understand about old Cormanthor. It was old. It was unimaginably old, in a way that nothing in the rest of the realms was old. And the elves who lived there had grown so accustomed to permanence that they did not really believe that anything could ever truly change. But change was coming, and the one who saw it coming clearly was a gold elf named Eltargrim Irithel. Eltargrim took the throne in -223 DR, the 6th coronal of his line, the 7th son of his father, Tanev. He was a warrior in build and bearing, though the chroniclers say he was more often seen in robes of state than in armor after he came to the throne. He had golden eyes and long silver-white hair, and he had the gift, rare among any people, but vanishingly rare among elves, of looking at his own civilization from the outside. What he saw frightened him. The human kingdoms to the west and south were no longer the scattered tribes and petty warlords of his ancestors' day. They were growing. They were building cities of stone. They were multiplying at a rate the elves could not match, and they were learning magic, slowly and clumsily at first, but with the relentless industry that defines that short-lived race. Eltargrim looked at the great forest of Cormanthor, and he understood, with the clarity of a man looking at a glacier, that the elves could not stand against the rising human tide forever. Numbers alone would eventually overwhelm them. And so, in defiance of every conservative voice in his court, he began to plan something no coronal before him had ever attempted. He planned to open the forest. In the year 220 DR, Eltargrim issued the first of his great edicts. He opened the woods of Cormanthor to any human wizard or druid who wished to come and learn, and to any non-elven settler who wished to come and live in peace among the trees. The reaction in the noble houses was as you might expect. Some accepted it as the coronal's wisdom and obeyed. Others muttered. A few began to plot. And in the human kingdoms to the west, a young man named Elminster Almar, then little more than a hedge mage with grief in his heart and a calling from the goddess Mistra hanging over him, heard about the offer and set out east, becoming, according to the chronicles, the first human ever to enter the elven city of Cormanthor as a student rather than as a captive. The opening, as it came to be called, did not stop at the forest's edge. Eltargrim had a larger ambition still. He believed that if the city itself, the capital, the heart of Cormanthor, opened its gates to dwarves and halflings and gnomes and humans, then the elves would do more than merely survive the coming age. They would lead it. He believed that the long lives of elves and the quick fire of humans, the deep craft of dwarves and the magic of gnomes, could together build something none of them could build alone. He believed this with the patient certainty of a man who had been thinking about it for centuries, and he was opposed at every turn. The opposition came from the great noble houses. House Sterim, ancient and proud, despised the very idea of letting lesser races walk the streets of Cormanthor. House Malgath, House Urdusk, House Haladavar, and others made their objections at sword point, which Eltargrim, in a phrase I have always loved, later classed as an error in judgment on their part. Attempts on his life followed. There was rebellion in his own court. The houses argued that opening the city would dilute its blood, weaken its magic, betray its history. Some of them were right about some of those things. None of them were right about the alternative, which was a slow and bitter decline into irrelevance. My reading of Eltargrim is that he loved his people too much to let them die comfortably. He loved them enough to force them into a future they did not want. To make the opening possible, the coronal needed something that had never been done. The elves had long used a kind of high magic called a Mythal, but Mythals as they then existed were raised only by the most senior practitioners of elven high magic, and they were small things, personal wards woven around a single archmage or a single grove. What Eltargrim needed was a Mythal that could cover an entire city, a vast magical lattice that would protect Cormanthor against the worst that an open gate might allow inside, a ward that could shape the very behavior of magic and beings within its bounds. No one knew how to make such a thing. No one, that is, except an elf named Mythal. He was a wizard whose ideas were ridiculed at court, a theorist who believed he could take the personal mythals of high magic and scale them up by orders of magnitude to cover a city. Most of his peers thought he was a fool. Eltargrim heard him out and gave him patronage. For decades, Mythal worked refining his theory, drafting his notes into the workbook, later known as Mythal's Folio. Beside him stood the Shrinshi, who in her time bore the name Oluevera Estelda, but is remembered to history only by her title. The Shrinshi was, depending on which moment in her long existence you catch her, the senior Grand Mage of the High Mages of Cormanthor, the Wardnorn of the Vault of Ages, the Loranorn of the Armathors, and the High Court Mage of Myth Drannor. She had served 3 coronals before Eltargrim, and at the time of the opening, she had only recently been restored to flesh and youth by Mystra herself, after centuries spent as a Baelnorn guardian of the coronal's most precious treasures. She was, I think, the most powerful elven wizard who ever lived, and she stood beside Mythal as he worked. The Starum did not give up. As Mythal approached the completion of his great spell, House Starum mounted a final coup against the coronal. The court was attacked. Wizards aligned with Starum tried to sabotage the casting itself. Mythal died in the chaos, his work apparently incomplete, his tower ransacked, and his folio stolen. By any reasonable measure, the opening should have ended there, in failure and blood, with the conservatives victorious and the dreams of Eltargrim buried with the man who had drafted them. It did not end there because the Shrinshi stepped out of the ruined court and finished the work. With a small circle of high mages, including the coronal himself, Lady Arendu Ekhorn, Lord Irenspear Ongluth, the human Elminster Amar, who had by then become an Armathor of the Elven City, and 10 others whose names the chronicles preserve in fragments, she raised the Mythal of Cormanthor. The year of soaring stars, 261 by the Dela reckoning, 12 years of preparation brought to completion in a single night by a circle of mages who had every reason to hate one another and chose, for one moment, not to. When the Mythal settled into place, Cormanthor was no longer Cormanthor. It was Myth Drannor, and the opening began. Eltargrim, by the way, would rule for another 4 centuries after that night. He had taken the throne in -223 DR, and he would not pass on until 661 DR. That is a reign of nearly 900 years. Even by Elven standards, this is extraordinary. He had time, in other words, to watch his dream take root and then mature. He saw the children born in the year of the opening grow old in Elven terms and have children of their own. He saw the first generation of dwarves who had come to live in Myth Drannor die of old age, while their grandchildren still lived in the same halls beneath the Elven streets. He saw the human students he had welcomed in their 20s grow into archmages and pass into legend in their 70s. By the time he died, no one in the city remembered a time when the gates had been closed. Eltargrim's gift, in the end, was patience. He opened the city, and then he stayed long enough to make the open city normal. What followed was the 400-year afternoon of Elven civilization, and I'm going to tell you about it before I tell you how it ended. Because if you do not understand what was lost, then the loss does not mean very much. Myth Drannor in its golden age was, by all surviving accounts, the most beautiful city that has ever stood on the face of Faerun. The Mythal regulated the very air. Summers were cooler than they should have been at that latitude, winters warmer. Flowers grew that grew nowhere else. The trees themselves shaped the streets, leaning in to form arched colonnades of living wood that did not need to be pruned because the Mythal taught them how to grow. The wards within the city changed the behavior of magic itself, making certain spells easier and certain others impossible, making teleportation between the wards instantaneous through the network of orreries placed in the great speculum grounds. Wizards came from every kingdom of the surface world to study under the masters of Myth Drannor. The 7 Wizards of Myth Drannor founded the first wizard school in Faerun that was open to all races, and from its halls walked, in time, students such as the young Kelvin Aronson, the future Blackstaff of Waterdeep. The great noble houses each carried their own treasures, and at the highest tier of these were the Moonblades. A Moonblade was a sentient longsword forged for a specific elven noble line, and the blade chose its wielder. To draw a Moonblade that did not wish to be drawn was to die. To bond with a Moonblade was to add one's own deeds to the blade's living memory, so that each generation's heir inherited a weapon and with it 1,000 years of ancestral judgment. The Moonblades of Myth Drannor were the spiritual equivalent of the Kira gems, the 2 great vessels of elven memory walking through the streets at the hip of every noble warrior. When a line failed and its Moonblade was lost, the elves felt it the way humans might feel the loss of a saint's relic. Many of these blades were lost in the fall. A few survived. Their stories alone would fill another chronicle. The city was divided into 4 great wards, each with its own character. Cormanthor, the Old City, sometimes called Aquilor, or the Place of Duty, was the oldest part of the metropolis and the seat of the coronal. There stood the Rule Tower and the Castle Cormanthor, the Throne, the homes of the great noble houses, the quarters of the Arms Major who commanded the Ac Velar, and the Spell Major who commanded the Ac Fair. There too lived many of the city's high mages. Shishiranam, the Temple Ward, was nearly as old as Cormanthor itself and housed the great temples of the Seldarine, the Elven pantheon, alongside the homes of those elven citizens who wished to live closest to the gods. At Nightingale Court within Shishiranam stood the Temple of Mystra, and beside it, the enchanted monument the elves called the Ear of Myth Drannor. Shondacle's throne, dedicated to the Rider of the Winds, was considered the greatest temple of that wandering god in all the realms. Around it was the Windrider Glade, a park of open shrines and gardens dedicated to the idea of peace and religious diversity itself, where the priests of a dozen faiths walked the same paths without hatred. I want you to pause on that for a moment. There was briefly in this world a public park in a capital city where the priests of every god could walk together. That is what was made here. That is what was lost. In the Speculum, the Guild Hall of Wizards founded by the Archmage Alagar of the Horns, the city's spellcasters met and traded and taught. The Speculum grounds around it were dotted with the orrery teleportation circles I mentioned, and with Windsong Tower, the 3rd great tower of the city after the Rule Tower and the castle. Through the gates of Myth Drannor poured dwarves of the Earthfast Mountains, gnomes from the deep dells, halflings from the river country, and humans from every kingdom that touched the eastern realms. The dwarves built halls under the city, with the elves' blessing. The halflings opened taverns. The gnomes brought clocks and curios. The humans brought trade and the slow, restless energy of a young race learning from an old one. By the year of the Bloody Tusk, 661 DR, 400 years after the opening, Myth Drannor reached the peak of its influence, and all the races living within its walls flourished under a sense of unity that had no equal anywhere else in Faerun. And in that same year, in the year of the bloody tusk, Eltargrim Irithiel died. The chroniclers say that he met his end well. He was old by even elven standards, and he had seen his dream made flesh, and on a midsummer morning during the festival, he woke and dressed in his ceremonial armor and went out to greet the dawn. He took up a song, he raised the elf blade, and he passed willingly into Arvandor, the land of the elven dead, leaving his crown behind. I think this matters. It matters because the city he left was at its very height, and because he believed, I suspect, that the work was now self-sustaining. He thought the dream could survive without him. He was wrong. He left a single heir, his grandniece Arave Irithyll, who was not ready to take the throne. She declared a 5-year period of mourning by ancient elven custom, rather than crown herself at once. She did not get 5 years. In 664 DR, 3 years into the morning, Aravai and her bodyguards were murdered by unknown assailants. The chroniclers do not name her killer in the open record, though the deed is laid at the feet of House Starim in the deeper histories. What we know is that with her death, the line of Irithyll effectively ended, and there was no clear successor to draw the Arcor Kerem from its place in the rule tower. What followed is, in my reading, the true beginning of the fall. Not the demons. Not the orcs, the succession. In 666 DR, the noble houses began to push their own candidates forward. The chroniclers record 40 deaths in the resulting claiming ceremony, and at the climax of it, the protective wards on the rule tower itself responded to whatever was attempted there, and the tower was destroyed. The elf blade itself was unharmed and fell to the rubble. The Srinshi, watching this disaster, stepped forward and drew the blade with effortless ease, the golden light of it crystallizing around her and a quartet of high mages in a vast diamond of energy. She did not, however, take the throne. She drew the blade only to prove that it could still be drawn, and then she went away. The histories say her heart was broken by what she had seen, and she retreated to a hidden resting place known only to one other elf, and she was not seen again in Myth Drannor for over 7 centuries. In her absence, the realm could find no coronal. In the year of austere ceremonies, 667 DR, by midsummer, a body called the Council took control of Cormanthor and Myth Drannor. They governed, technically. In practice, they were 12 heads of noble houses, each pursuing the interests of their own line. They struck trade deals that favored their families. They set up power holds in the sister cities of Semberholm and the Elven court. They forgot, with the steady drift of small choices made by self-interested people, the dreams of the coronals who had come before them. Within 4 decades, Cormanthor dissolved from a unified realm into a collection of feuding city-states. The dwarves began to leave. The halflings drifted away. The gnomes departed for kinder hosts. Some of the humans stayed, but most went back to their kingdoms. The Mythal still stood, and the city still glowed, and from a distance the towers were still beautiful. But the dream was gone. What remained was a beautiful, empty stage, waiting for a tragedy. The tragedy was, of course, on its way, and it had been on its way for nearly 2,000 years. To explain what was coming, I have to take you back, briefly, to a moment buried in the old history of the forest. More than 18 centuries before the fall of Myth Drannor, an elven wizard named Saival Amath performed one of the strangest experiments in the recorded history of the realms. He took a red dragon's egg and altered it through arcane ritual. He shaped its physiology toward that of a blue dragon while preserving its red dragon heritage, and most strangely of all, he altered its very nature, hatching a dragon that was lawful and good rather than chaotic and cruel. He named the dragon Garnet, or in some accounts, Garnetalastar. Saival and Garnet became inseparable companions, and Garnet often flew low over the forest of Cormanthor, looking in on the elven settlements and the holy places of the elves below. In that same long-ago era, 3 Yugoloths, fiends of the lower planes called Nikoloths, had been bound by elven magic into a mystical prison suspended more than a mile above what would, in time, become Myth Drannor itself. Their names were Olmpeter, Golguth, and Malimshare, sometimes called collectively the Trio Nefarious. The chroniclers debate who summoned them in the first place. Some say it was a Flynn shaman of the orcs, some say a human archmage. Some accounts blame the Netherese archwizards, sending Yugoloths into the elven forest merely to test what magic the elves could field against an attack from the great human empire of the north. Whoever did it, the elves caught the 3 Nikoloths, and the elves imprisoned them, and the elves wrote into the binding ritual a single curious condition for the prison's release. The bindings would dissolve, the chroniclers say, when a red dragon that had never known malice or greed in its heart flew over the coronal's throne. The elves who wrote that condition must have laughed. Such a dragon does not exist. Such a dragon cannot exist. Red dragons are creatures of avarice and rage by their very nature. The condition was a joke at the expense of 3 bound fiends, a poetic way of saying never. And then, 16 centuries later, Saval Amath bred Garnet, and Garnet flew where Saval flew, and Saval flew over Castle Cormanthor. The trio nefarious slipped their bonds slowly and patiently, brooding in their prison through the centuries it took for the binding to weaken and finally fail. By the time they fell free, the prison had grown thin enough that a single ritual on the outside could finish the work. A Gnoll shaman of the Moonsea, working with magic that should never have come into the hands of such a creature, completed the summons. The 3 Nikoloths fell to earth, free for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, full of 19 centuries of patient hatred, and they went immediately to work. They went to the goblin tribes, they went to the ogres, they went to the orcs and the bugbears and then the gnolls with a combination of magic, raw brute force, and the kind of terror that only a fiend of the lower planes can apply. They organized the scattered humanoid peoples of the Moonsea region into a single, cohesive force. By the time anyone in Myth Drannor understood what was happening, an army had formed under the trees north of the city that the elves would, in due course, name the Army of Darkness. Word of this army first reached Myth Drannor through Captain Flar Starbrow Melruth, a moon elf of the Ak Velar and one of the great captains of his generation. Flar established a watch post at Helmgrove, north of the city, and stationed there a company called the Shield of Myth Drannor. The Shield brought back the first detailed reports of what was coming, and the Council of 12, to its credit, listened. Allies were called. Cormyrian war wizards rode east to help. The folk of the Dales mustered such fighters as they could spare. The Akfair and Akvalar made ready. But the city's traditional allies in Evereska, Evermeet, and Silvery Moon did not come. The Drow of the Underdark, who had been raiding the northern reaches of Cormanthor for years, chose this moment to seize the surface in earnest, and their pressure on the Elven heartland was just enough to prevent any aid from reaching Myth Drannor from the west. Whether the Drow knew the Army of Darkness was coming or simply exploited its arrival, the result was the same. The City of Song would fight alone. The Weeping War began in the year of despairing elves, 711 DR. The opening gambit, which the elves would later call the Northern Massacres, was a tide of darkness rolling south through the upper reaches of Cormanthor. Outposts were overrun, villages were burned. Whole companies of the Akvalar were swallowed and never seen again. For 2 years, the war ground southward, and for those 2 years, the elves fought with the desperation of a people who were beginning to understand that they were not going to win. There were moments of brilliance in those years that I want you to remember, because they were not for nothing. The elves slew 2 of the 3 Nikoloths. Golgoth and Malimshare died in those campaigns. Their commanders pulled down by elven blades and elven spells. The forces of Cormanthor managed briefly to retake the elven court itself, the holy heart of the old realm, before being driven out again. These victories did not turn the war. They could not turn the war, but they bought time, and the time was used to evacuate the elven civilians from the path of the Army of Darkness. Most of the citizens of Myth Drannor who survived the war survived because of what those campaigns bought. That is worth remembering. The dying bought time for the living, and the living escaped. There was one battle in the middle years of the war that the chroniclers single out above the rest. In the Tarsak of 712 DR, what historians call the Second Siege of Drannor, the army of darkness drove the elven defenders back to the walls and punched through. The bulk of the fighting that followed was waged among the streets of the old city of Cormanthor itself, and the climax of it centered on the Silver Gate, the magical portal that connected Drannor to Silvery Moon Pass, far to the west. The Silver Gate battle was a battle of magic more than blades. Spellmager Josediah Starum, the human Elminster Amar, returned to the city he had once helped to make, the lady Simristar Oglamir, and the wizard the chronicles call only the Nameless Chosen, who would later become Kelban Aronson the Elder, stood together at the gate. The Nameless Chosen was nearly torn in two by the Mesaloth Whipmaster Sivor, and lay near death for over a year. Elminster was thrown across the plains when he turned the gate's energies inward to destroy it. Ecamane Truesilver of Silvery Moon, working from the far end of the portal, gave her life to seal its terminus. The Silver Gate was destroyed. The army of darkness was, for a time, driven east. Drannor survived the second siege. The elves bought another 2 years. In those 2 years, the city's last great hope took the air. The good red dragon Garna Talasar, descendant of Saval Amath's altered hatchling, came down from his high places and threw himself recklessly at the army of darkness in what the chroniclers call the Battle of Garnet's Pyre. He divided the main force, he trapped formations behind forest fires, he broke their supply lines, and then, late in that battle, Garnet went missing and was never seen again. The good dragon had bought the elves perhaps a season. It was not enough. The end came in the late campaigns of 714 DR, the Year of Doom. The Army of Darkness, rebuilt and reinforced, broke through the western front of the Elven defense and reached the city itself. In a separate battle at the Warrior's Gate, the magical portal to the southwest was destroyed in such a violent magical detonation that the blast emerged from the far end of the portal and devastated the human city of Delambiron, and a great swathe of southern Delambir along with it. By the 21st of Kythorn, 714, the Army of Darkness had reached the walls. The Akvalar had been reduced from a great host to 3,000 defenders. Beyond the walls, the Army of Darkness numbered 10 times that or more, and was led now only by Olmpiter, the last of the trio Nefarious. This was the Siege of Shadows, the final siege, the end. The battle that followed lasted weeks and ended, the chroniclers say, in a duel. On the 15th of Flamerule, 714 DR, Olmpiter called Captain Flar forward in single combat. The two of them fought for 2 days, the Nikoloth Lord against the Moon Elf Captain, Fiend against Soldier, the leaders of the two armies facing each other while the war ground on around them. At the climax of their combat, a magical blast engulfed them both, and both were slain. Their bodies were never recovered. The chronicles call this the Bane's Duel, and it left both armies leaderless. If the story ended there, it would be a kind of victory. The trio Nefarious was destroyed. The architect of the Army of Darkness was gone. But the Army of Darkness did not need leadership anymore. It was a mass too large to stop, and even leaderless, it overran the city. Out of the 3,000 defenders who had remained at the walls, barely 200 elves and allies escaped the fall. The rest died in the streets, in the towers, in the temples, in the houses they had built 400 years before. The wizards who refused to leave their towers were blown apart along with them, and as they died, they released their spells in uncontrolled bursts that warped the surrounding districts and seeded the ruins with the wild magic that haunts them to this day. The Hall of the Wizards was rendered a cursed and dangerous place by a single misfired spell during the last hours of the siege. Castle Cormanthor was burned. The Rule Tower had already been destroyed half a century before. The Speculum was sacked. The Temple of Shondakul fell. The Windrider Glade burned. By the end of the 15th of Flamerule, Drannor was lost. The survivors fled. Most went to the Elven Court, which became, briefly, the new and lesser capital of a shattered Cormanthor. Others went to Semberholm. Some went west to Evereska and Evermeet. The city itself was occupied for a few years by the surviving humanoids of the Army of Darkness. But as the centuries wore on, the orcs and goblins moved on or died off, and stranger things came to take their place. Devils that had been summoned in the final battles remained. Demons drifted in through the broken places in the Mythal. The Farim came up from below. The drow of the city of Meramidra extended their grasp into the surrounding forest, taking what would later be called Shadowdale. A pool of radiance formed beneath Castle Cormanthor, the kind of magical wound that does not heal. The cult of the dragon found their way there in due course and tried to bathe their Dracolicas in its waters. The cult of the Dark Naga came. The Lich Druthairn lured them in, and the Farim killed them and raised them as Bone Naga servants, and so on, century after century. For 700 years, Drannor was a ruin, not an empty ruin, a populated ruin, populated by things that should not have been there. Adventurers came. Some came back, most did not. The ruins became one of the great morbid pilgrimages of Faerun, a place where the bold and the foolish went to test themselves against the residue of dying magic and the things that had crawled in to feed on it. The chroniclers of Sembia and the Dales kept lists for a while of the parties that had set out east for Drannor and never returned. The lists became long enough that the chroniclers eventually stopped keeping them. The Mythal itself, broken but still in some places functional, continued to leak. Cormanthor, the forest, grew strange under the influence of the dying magic. The weather remained milder than it had any right to be. The plants and animals grew larger and stranger than their cousins outside the woods. Pockets of wild magic dotted the city's streets, places where spells misfired or rewrote themselves in mid-cast, where teleports went sideways and time itself ran slightly wrong. The Elven sword orders of the Knights of Drannor formed in the late centuries to do what could be done, slowly, patiently, to clear the worst of the infestations and to keep the very deepest evils contained. Elminster, who had survived the fall, visited the ruins many times across the centuries, sometimes alone and sometimes guiding those few mortals he judged worthy. In 1357 DR, he led a band of adventurers through the city's broken barriers and drove out a possessing spirit that had taken root in the ruins. The following month, the Knights of Drannor sealed a portal the followers of Bane had opened a decade earlier. Devils remained. 12 years later, in the Year of the Gauntlet, the cult of the dragon under Ciamordrain established themselves in Castle Cormanthor and began their work with the Pool of Radiance, hoping to make a god of their Dracolic Palindralar. They were eventually defeated. But the work of cleansing Drannor was no closer to being finished. In the late 14th century DR, something happened that almost no one expected. The elves came back. The retreat had begun in 1344 DR, when the elven peoples of Cormanthor, exhausted by centuries of slow attrition and grief, withdrew the bulk of their population to other lands, mostly to Evermeet. More than 90% of the elves of Cormanthor abandoned the Great Forest in those years. The drow, sensing weakness, moved up to fill the void. For 30 years it seemed that Cormanthor was finally dead. And then, in 1374 DR, House Dlardrageth, an ancient fairy line of elves, corrupted by demonic blood, attempted to seize Drannor itself. Their plot drew in the Gentarim, the city of Hilsfar, the merchant princes of Sembia, and the folk of the Dales. The conflict became known as the Cormanthor War. And in response to it, Evermeet sent the largest elven army to march on the surface in many centuries, the Elven Crusade under Severil Miritar. Severil Miritar was a sun elf nobleman and a high priest of Corlan Larethian, and his daughter, the spellarker Ilsevel Miritar, served as one of his captains. The crusade broke House Dlardrageth, drove the Zhentarim out of the woods, and reclaimed Drannor for the first time in 7 centuries. Severil died in the fighting. His daughter Ilsevel took command of what was now called the Army of Drannor and finished the war. Then, in 1377 DR, something happened that no one had thought possible. The Shrinshi returned. 711 years after she had disappeared from the city, the most powerful elven wizard who had ever lived walked into the rebuilt court of Cormanthor, and she offered the ruler's blade to Ilsevel Miritar. Ilsevel drew it. The blade accepted her. She was crowned coronal of Cormanthor, the first coronal of the present age. Captain Flar, resurrected by her father Savril Miritar from across the centuries, became her consort. What followed was a brief, bright, fragile renaissance. The Mythal was patched and restored. The streets were cleared. The temples were rebuilt. Elven families returned from Evermeet, hesitantly at first and then in greater numbers. The city's population grew until, by 1479 DR, perhaps 10,000 souls lived in Drannor once more. It was not the city it had been. It would never be the city it had been. But for the first time in 7 centuries, the bells rang again at Nightingale Court, and the coronal sat the throne, and the dream did not feel entirely lost. My reading of this period is that it was the kindest thing the gods of Faerun ever did for the elves of Cormanthor, and that the elves themselves did not entirely believe it was real, and that they were right not to believe, because Netheril had returned. A century before, in 1372 DR, the Netherese flying city of Thultanthar, sometimes called Shade by those who knew its translated name, had come back to Faerun after 17 centuries of exile on the Plane of Shadow. Its high prince was Telemont Tanthal, and behind him was the goddess Shar, the Lady of Loss, who had her own designs upon the weave of magic itself. For 100 years, the Shadowvar of Thultanthar expanded across Faerun, building a new Netheril, gathering ancient artifacts, undermining anyone who could stand against them. In time, their gaze fell upon Drannor, and they saw the Mythal, and they understood that the magical lattice of that city was one of the great obstacles in their path to seizing the weave for their goddess. In 1487 DR, the year of the Rune Lords Triumphant, a coalition of mercenary armies, paid and led by the Shadowvar, laid siege to Drannor. The elves defended the city with the same ferocity they had shown in the Weeping War, and they inflicted terrible losses on the besiegers. But they were outnumbered 20-1 and worse, and not a single elf that fell could be replaced. The chroniclers note this with the bleak honesty of people who had seen it before. The outcome was inevitable. The siege itself, however, was a feint. The Shadowvar's true objective was to prevent the elves from mounting a coherent magical defense of their Mythal, while the real work was done elsewhere. The Mythal of Drannor and the wards of the Monastery of Candlekeep, half a continent away, were both in different ways in Shar's path. Both had to fall. In the end, it was Elminster who finished it. The Sage of Shadowdale, who had been there at the opening, who had stood at the Silver Gate during the first fall, who had walked these ruins for centuries and watched them rebuilt at last, brought Thultanthar to ground. The flying city fell out of the sky on the first day of Hammer, 1487 DR, the dawn of the year of the Rune Lords Triumphant. It fell upon Drannor. Thultanthar was destroyed in the crash. Drannor was destroyed with it. Ilsevel and her surviving subjects fled south to Semberholm. The Second Cormanthor was over. And so the city ends, as nearly all great cities end, with the ruling caste fleeing south and the streets behind them in flame, twice ruined. Once by demons and once by a city falling from the sky. And in both cases, the chroniclers note, the fall took only days, while the building had taken centuries. I have walked the timeline of Drannor from minus 3,983 DR to 1487 DR with you, and I want to spend the time we have left on what the city actually means, what its lesson is, whether it has one. The easy reading, the one most often offered, is that Drannor fell because the elves let outsiders in, that the opening doomed the city, that the lower races brought corruption and weakness, and that the trio nefarious found their opportunity because the gates were unguarded. I think this reading is wrong, and I think it is wrong in a way that flatters every conservative noble who ever lifted a knife against Eltargrim. The trio nefarious were imprisoned over the city long before the opening. The Drow had been moving against the elves for centuries. The decay of the Council of 12 was a decay of elven noble houses, not a decay imposed by the dwarves or the halflings or the gnomes. The demi-human peoples of Drannor were not the cause of its fall. They were among its victims. To blame the opening for the fall is to confuse the closing of the dream with its beginning. A second reading is that the city fell because Eltargrim's dream depended too much on him. When he died, the dream withered. The line failed. The Council of 12 filled the vacuum with their own ambitions. The houses turned against one another. The Mythal could not protect against the slow rot of self-interest. There is, I think, a great deal of truth in this. Eltargrim built a civilization around a vision that required one wise ruler after another to sustain it. And when the line broke, he had no fallback. The elf blade, which was meant to test character, instead tested only ambition, and ambition is not the same as wisdom. My reading is that the great mistake of Eltargrim was not the opening. It was failing to build a system that could survive his own death. The dream was beautiful. The dream was right. The dream simply was not robust enough to weather a single broken succession. A third reading is the one I find I keep returning to. Drannor fell because something was always going to fall it. The trio nefarious were bound 19 centuries before they fell. The drow were always moving. The Furim were always there. Netheril, even in its long absence, was always going to come back. The forest was too rich and too magical to remain quiet forever, and any city in it would eventually be tested. Drannor was tested twice. It failed twice. What is remarkable is not that it fell. What is remarkable is that it stood at all for 400 years the first time and 100 the second, that the dream was made flesh and walked the streets for nearly half a millennium before the end came. Most dreams do not live that long. Most dreams never make it out of one ruler's head. When I think of Drannor now, I do not think of the demons. I do not even think of the towers. I think of Windrider Glade, the open-air park with shrines to a dozen gods, where the priests of different faiths walked the same paths in peace. I think about the dwarven halls under the Elven city, and the halflings in their taverns, and the human students learning at the speculum, and the gnomes selling clocks in the markets. I think of an old elven king, golden-eyed and silver-haired, walking out into a midsummer dawn in his ceremonial armor, taking up a song, and passing willingly into Arvandor because he believed the work was done. He was wrong. The work was not done. The work was never going to be done because the work was the kind that has to be redone every generation, by every people in every age. That was the lesson of Drannor that the elves did not want to hear, and that the rest of us are still not very good at hearing either. Peace is not a thing you build once. Peace is a thing you build and protect and lose, and build again until you cannot build any longer, and then the next people have to take up the work. The City of Song was not the failure of a beautiful idea. The City of Song was the proof that the beautiful idea is possible, even if only for a little while, even if only in one corner of one forest, even if only until the next disaster. The towers are broken now. The Mythal is dust. The streets are full of roots and bones. Ilsevel and her people are in Semberholm, building what they can from what little remains. The Shrinshi is gone, the chroniclers say, having spent herself in the last battle against Larlock in the final siege. Elminster lives still, though he is much diminished by the wars of the age. The forest of Cormanthor goes on growing. Someday, perhaps, an elven coronal will sit a throne in the heart of these woods again. Perhaps the third Cormanthor will be raised in the bones of the first two. Perhaps a circle of mages, with patience and time and a little luck, will weave a new Mythal over a new city, and the song will be sung again. Or perhaps the City of Song will remain what it is now, a memory and a warning and a wound in the heart of the eastern forest, a place where travelers pause without meaning to because the light has changed and the birds are different, and they can almost hear something just beneath the wind. That is the way I would have it remembered if I had any say in the matter, not as a city that fell, as a city that was made, as a city that was lived in, as a city that was, for a little while, what cities ought to be and almost never are. Drannor, the City of Song, twice raised, twice ruined, and not yet entirely gone.